Okay, well, so I can say this is all based on me getting a slow introduction and understanding about using UV flies or materials in flies for as an additional attractor, like an attractor pattern, as much more as an imitative pattern. And where I sit there and I just finished watching recently, was it David at Sir David Attenbury or something like that, that he did a program, and in one of their shows and everything else, they talked about the UV is a part of the spectrum that we don't see, but many animals and creatures and everything else, that's an important part of what they sit there and see. And so we've been using UV materials for hot spots for quite some time, but my first introduction to that was when I first joined the club. There was he had since gone back down to the States, but was a member of the club for a long time, a fellow by the name of Bill Phillips. And what he had brought up was a fly that he had seen and was using from that Fran Betters had tied up.
And a guy named Bill Phillips that wrote The Stream and the Rod walked in that day, and he happened to hang around my shop a lot. And I looked at him and I said, Bill, I got a new fly for you to try out. He took the half a dozen of them and went out in the stream, and he came back a couple of hours later and he had a big grin on his face. And Bill had big bushy eyeballs and he always had a pipe in his mouth. He said, I'll be damned, that thing works. And Bill fished that fly for many years until he died. But he would be fishing in the Catskills or Pennsylvania or wherever, and people would ask him, what did you get those trout on, Bill? And he'd say, the usual. So I named the fly the usual and did an article for Fly Fishing Magazine on it. And that name is stuck.
And that was called the usual. And what it did as part of its material, it had the fluorescent red thread and using snowshoe rabbit fur and everything else. And when the fly got wet and everything else, the fluorescent red thread would show through the body and give the body a bit of color. So that was one of the very first flies that I saw that had all of that UV, that sense of UV. But it was also part of in the older club days, there was there were a number of other different flies that sort of came into existence there. Yes. Oh, before I forget, if you want to sit there and see a number of different ways of fishing the usual, Bill Christmas did an article and everything else on the submerger technique and everything else, and how he'd be cast up. He'd sit there and yank the fly underneath the water to let it pop up. And it was either imitating like a diving egg-laying caddis or something just coming up and emerging into the surface film. Because if you sit there and greased up the usual and everything else, it was like a cork. It would come right back up and break through the surface. So the next really strong fly that I learned a little bit more about UV materials was tied by one of a former club member. He passed away now, but he was a very strong member of the club, was Morris Howe. We've got an award named in his honor and everything else that we pass along to people throughout the club, the Morris Howe Award. But his fly that sort of taught me a little bit more about all this was the baby doll. And now when he sat there and he specifically talked about the baby doll, he talked about a certain brand of material for this white wool. Do I have that? Yeah, I've got a little ball of it here. And, you know, I sit there and I tried tying the fly with the white and everything else, because he used to fish out at the Rainbow Ranch, and he sit there and he would just nail the fish all the time. That was a club that existed up in Guelph at one point in time. And but he sit there, and while he tied it with fluorescent red thread and everything else, it wasn't until, you know, Elliot Dayton actually showed me a sample of one of his flies, because Elliot was a very good friend with Morris and did a lot of fishing with him. And so he ended up showing me one of these flies, the baby doll. And what it was is that, I don't know if it'll show up if I do it on this thing, but when we sit there and actually got a sample of his flies, you know, ours looked the same, but it wasn't the same wool as that. Was because the wool that he used, the white would glow under UV light. And so it wasn't, so after that point in time, we couldn't buy the exact same wool. But what we ended up doing is going into like, one of the craft shops and everything else that sells a lot of wool. And that's where we ended up finding some white wool that did have the same properties, that when you put a UV light onto it and everything else, it would glow, it would highlight and glow. So that's one of the things we started learning from all of that. But another of Morris's flies that he made famous was the Hamel's Killer. Now, originally, Morris was out of England and everything else, and he would tie up a lot of flies. He had friends. I think the original Hamel's Killer came out of New Zealand or Australia, if I'm not mistaken. And well, originally they sat there and they had tied the fly with a green mallard tied along the sides like a Miss Simpson. Well, Morris didn't quite understand that, so he ended up with tying the mallard so that it was on top and very flat and everything else. And in a way, I think it sort of made it look an awful lot more like a small crayfish than it did anything else. But again, some of the materials that they had and everything else is like we were shopping around so that you can sit there and see that with the UV light and everything else, you can get these things to just absolutely glow, just by the way you select things and everything else. And so one of the flies that I tied up for them was what we called the Franklin Wiggler, which was purple and it had a little bit of orange in it. You can see it there. See, you normally wouldn't see the dots on there and everything else, but you start using different inks and everything else, you can make these little dots show up along the side and everything else. They're like hidden with the light's not on it, but everything else, but it's just affected by UV. And in some ways, it looked like some of the leeches that they had inside of their lakes and everything else that had spots on it and everything else. So it turned out to be a fairly effective fly again. We ended up, there's other flies that I developed that were based on Jack Sutton's fly, the Ducky Darling. And I did abbreviated versions, one I called the Blackjack and one the Little Darling, depending on which style it was tied in. One was more like a nymph and another one was more like a wet fly. But it was, again, using hot oranges and everything else up there. But we started talking about it. But inside their clubhouse, they had a raft of number of different framed fly sets, like from Sutton, from other older club members and everything else. Over the years, people, they had sit there and had tied flies for them. Well, what I did is I sat there and, we tried to determine, what, these flies, why were they so effective and everything else. When I said, well, let's curiously, we went and took our UV lights and we started going through these framed sets of flies, some of the older ones. And yeah, it was surprisingly, for things that were just tied with natural materials, how many of the real successful ones had the UV light would just. So, but not only did we sit there and find so many of the many flies that they had on display, but it was even some of the salmon flies that they had on display. Some of the natural materials that they were using from the fully dressed salmon flies, you sit there and you put on a UV light onto them, and it would something in there, whether it would be the floss or silk that they used for the tag end, or whether it was some of the winging material that would have been married together, you would find that all of a sudden, with a bit of UV light, it was hitting that too. So you sit there and you start running. These are flies that have been really, really successful, in various fishing circumstances. So it makes you think more and more that, okay, there's more to this than just what we can see, but this what they can see and what they want. And so after checking out a lot of the other flies and everything else, we started getting into the saltwater. We started traveling down to Cape Cod, and there was originally Mike Rowan and Ted Armstrong and myself went down for the first year for a Federation of Fly Fishers saltwater conclave, and we saw a lot. It was like a real eye-opening and everything else. We saw all kinds of different things, and we actually went out on one of the sessions where Lou Tabery took a small class of us out to the water and showed us various flies and different things like that. And so we ended up, that became one of our go-to flies, was the Lou Tabery's snake fly. And he sat there and it was like white, black, or green. And wouldn't you know it that the white one, the material was again something that if you sat there and you put a UV light onto it, all that white material would just glow. So it made it sort of like a little bit brighter as it went down into the water column. It would sit there and just be a little brighter. It's almost like we have today. And you go, if you took a UV light and you went down into where your laundry soap is or something like that, and you shone it on the outside of the bottle where parts of the laundry detergent has dribbled, it too will glow because they put UV brighteners in most of your laundry detergent, liquid laundry detergents and everything else to make your whites whiter than white, all of that kind of stuff. So there are things in there that we can artificially or naturally do. But that started me thinking as well too, as there are other flies. Now we've had up at our forum, one of our forums, we had Bob Clauser came up, and I became a fan of a number of his flies after seeing that. And one of the flies that he had that I really liked was and started using was the Clauser's crippled minnow. And just again, some of that white material, just a little bit of UV light on it, and it just lights it right up. And that also leads us to one of the other flies that he's very famous, Bob Clauser is very famous for, was the Clauser minnow. Now, typically when we were going down to the Cape and everything else, where people would sit there and say, you use a chartreuse over white fly, and that was what you would fish during the daytime. Well, of the group that went down there, we had our own house, and there was we came up with a fly that we called the House Clauser. Now that was like Mike Rowe and Ted Armstrong, Ken Geddes, myself at first, and eventually Paul Schlody ended up becoming part of that. And it was like again a group of us that we developed this Clauser minnow that was made out of fluorescent yellow, but top and bottom, and then we had a secret ingredient inside of that too. Well, the rest of the fluorescent stuff was glowing and everything else. What also added in there, we ended up buying and getting for, like, instead of Flashaboo, we bought material that was glow in the dark. So after you shine a bright light on it and everything else, and it went down on the water column, that little lateral line that we put in there would still have to be bright enough to gather some attention and everything else. And we'd show people the fly. We'd be fishing right beside them. We'd show them the fly and they could tie it up and everything else. But because the fluorescent yellow and the phosphorescent material that was in there blended so well together, they could look at the fly and they'd never know. So this was our secret for more than 20 years, where we sat there and had this one fly that worked so well for us. And it also brought a number of, it worked in the evening and everything else, but it brought along some good memories. And one of those memories for me is being out with fishing with Paul Schlody, the two of us. The other guys were sitting back enjoying scotch in the house, and him and I decided to go out for a late night fish. And we were on the east end of the canal. And that was the night that Paul caught his first keeper fish and everything else. So that was like that's when you pulled the little flask out of the vest and you sit there and said, Yahoo, okay, here's to you, here's to it. So you had the small little celebrations like that. But so when you are looking for, and you are realizing that so many flies that maybe you want to sit there and add a little bit of hotspot, whether it be with your fluorescent red thread, or in a lot of the cases, we've had something that I brought around to the club. It was called Club Thread. Now, basically, this was a thread that and unfortunately, I don't remember the gentleman's name who originally first gave me a sample of this thread. It was like on a small spool and everything else, and it was super, super strong. It was like almost like a floss that you could split it open and you could put the dubbing material into and spin it and everything else. If you wanted it to be any other color, you could just take a marker pen, and we'd often use, if we wanted hot colors or something, we'd take the marker pens, like the fluorescent marker, or the blue, green, orange, or whatever you want. You could change the color of your thread. This has had a small amount, and we went off to try and find this stuff. So I lent a sample of this thread to my friend Mike Scanlon. And if you remember the series MASH, how Rader O'Reilly was the company clerk, that he could find anything anywhere when if you really give him the job to it. Mike Scanlon was like that. He was our company clerk, as it were, when it came to scrounging and finding materials. And I don't know how many places he found or sent samples off to, but he ended up sending a sample off to a DuPont factory that was just down the road here. And it turns out this was a thread that they were using to sew up their life jackets. So it didn't deteriorate very much. It was very high strength for the size of it and everything else. And so he ended up, they sent him some samples of the thread. And they sent him three spools of the thread. And so ever since then, I've had various friends and off the Franklin Club, and I brought it into the Walton Club. And I do up spools of thread. And I sit there and I exchange these ones for empty spools, because I can do that. Because I'll show you my spool that I got, and that I don't think I'm going to run out of any too soon. That's my spool of lifetime supply of thread. So I'm always been more than willing to share. So it's been around. So I have to thank my friend Mike Scanlon for that. It was a great find for us. And if you want a really cheap version of a UV light, there are these pens that are basically they're kids' party favors or something like that. It's meant for like kids to write invisible messages on it and everything. And when you pull the little tab on it and everything else, it's got a little built-in UV light on the end of it. So like, I mean, I got these things, I think, from Amazon or something like that. And it was like half a dozen different colors or something like that. So you can mark your color, your threads and everything else if you want to put hotspots.
Hey, Jim, we just got a question in the chat box.
Okay.
Coming from Bruce. He says, what about UV resins? Do they add UV colors to Corona?
No. They just the UV resins just sit there and they're hardened by UV, so they still stay clear and stuff like that. So they don't add any color itself. UV light that I bought was from Loon, and so it was expensive, more so than it should have been. But for those of you guys interested, there is a light that you can get from Home Hardware. It's called Defiant. And they use it is for checking various leaks or for like insects and everything else in basements. And this light, it's got like nine things and everything else, and I use it to cure everything, $7. So it's don't go for the really $20, $35 light and everything else. When you can get something like that, you can have more than one. But I also, what I do is I end up taking this when I go to the fly tying shops and everything else. I sit there and I use this to buying a lot of my materials, natural materials and everything else. Like, I mean, I've even got like, this is a mask off of, I believe, an Arctic fox. Now, there's a lot of different white materials, and you shine the light on it, it won't glow. But why not sit there and just get something that actually can do that? I've done that for bucktail. I've gotten some of the materials like that way. I have, and this is for part of club history in its own way and everything. So I got a small little piece of what was probably banned for use now is polar bear. Now, what this came from was the early club days and everything else. It also has a natural. It's lit up a little bit by the UV light too. Phil Kettle, who was a president and vastly active member of the Walton Club, couldn't believe he was driving home one day and somebody had thrown out a whole polar bear rug out into the garbage. He drove, he whipped around, got back, and came back and picked it up, threw it in the back of his car, and headed home. And what he did, in all the kindness of his heart and everything else, is he cut up that polar bear rug and gave all of us a little sample that we could use, so that this thing didn't get wasted. I don't know if it was just worn out in a couple of spots and the people no longer wanted it. But that's how I got that thing. It was like it was going to go on its way to the dump, and Phil Kettle rescued it for all of the club members at that time. So I mean, credit to him for being so kind and doing that. So naturally, we have all of the different, like the fluorescents that are done into bucktails, or even the whites that you can get along there. But some of the materials, like if you want to, instead of like the golden pheasant tippet material, Lady Amherst is the white and black for your tail material. That stuff also will sit there and light up with the UV lights. And you've got naturally you've got some stuff that is like your marabou and everything else that'll sit there and head up, but also some of your long schlappen feathers as well too. So, and even when I've gone shopping there and I've managed to get that, going back to the start of the whole story and everything else, is a snowshoe rabbit's foot that sits there and lights up, and that's where everything is as usual, as they say. So I mean,
I live out in BC, and we do a lot with balanced leeches and chronomids. But
Yep.
I was wondering, can you buy tungsten beads that are glow in the dark, like UV reacting?
I don't know if you can or not, but I mean, you could always try putting some stuff on that. I've never seen that as per se. I mean, you can buy. Where have I got here? I thought of somewhere. I ended up. There are glow dark and beads and stuff like that are available. One of the my friend Elliot Dayton tied this one. He showed me it has the glow, the bead that will sit there and will light up and everything else as well too.
One last question I have for you. On cloudy days or low light, the effectiveness of the UV features or factors won't play as big a part, right?
No, well, not really. I mean, I understand blue light will carry a little bit further than infrared and everything else, and a little bit deeper into the water column. But that's why we started using some of the stuff, that little glow in the dark stuff, because even on dull overcast days, it was just enough to give a little bit of power to it and bring it down. It's better than not having it in that regard. I mean, I think even you sit there and you notice on dull overcast days, you can sit there and if somebody's walking around, you'll sit there in one of those vests and everything else. That was an interesting thing. I remember watching it on one of these science programs and everything else, and how they came up with fluorescence and everything else. It was originally, they found this in a jellyfish, that as it got down in the water column, they had a rim around the edge of it, and that was glowing green. And when they bring it up, it'd have a different color, but down there. And they found it was the way different proteins were bound in and everything else. So scientifically, that's how they ended up finding out the chemical composition and how to start making various fluorescent materials. And by changing the other base metals or something that are inside there, they changed it from just the green off to the red, and there are various things as well too. So, it's kind of interesting. But some of these flies that were well outdated that scientific advancement of figuring out how to make man-made fluorescence. So,
hey Jim, is there anything? Are there any dark colors that fluoresce? Like, do you ever find blacks or browns that fluoresce?
no, I haven't not saying it doesn't exist, but I haven't found it. But what I've tended to do is when I wanted to have a dark something like that, I would say if I'm going to do like a dubbing material or something like that, I would take small colored dub blends and everything else, and adds like a little bit of the white or different other color into the dubbing material and spin it up so there was little flecks of UV.
So things like, because there are some like classic black flies that work really well. Like I think of things like the black woolly bugger. Have you ever heard of like a Stewart spider, like the classic black one? So like, is that like you say those are only in certain situations where it's really light? Like the black works, or
I can't. I said the black is one of the flies that we would use at night on the Cape Cod and everything else. We tie the snake fly and everything else. I mean, we had this is a white one, but that was about the size that we do. It was actually in black, and when you sat there and you thought about it, and it was the fish are below, and the black was actually giving you more of a contrast against the night sky even still, or even to where everything else. So. I don't roll it out and everything else, but black has got is like
it's got something to it too. Yeah, I know, because that's what I think. For some reason, black works. I don't understand why, but it does. Like,
Well, we had a club member here. It was Owen Fisher at one point in time, and we used to tease Owen because he said that he'd fish any fly. He'd fish any fly that he could get his hands on, and use so long as it was black with a red tail.
The red tail, yeah, that's not a bad strategy.
Jim, I got a question for you. Do you ever get crazy and start putting the UV light on bugs to see if they glow more?
I haven't had that opportunity, but some of them probably do, and everything else. You know, I mean, the bug collection that I have, they're in like a formaldehyde solution or alcohol solution. So I doubt if they'd still glow. But this is also the stuff that's glow in the dark. And so, I mean, all the stuff that I sit there and seen when it's glow in the dark almost tends to have more just a greeny look to it. The bioluminescence. I mean, the first time that I ever saw that in real life, that sort of had me wondering what was going on when I was walking at night on the sandy shores down in Cape Cod, and everywhere I was stepping at, there was I didn't know it, but I was disturbing the stuff it was wherever I'd step, it was almost had glowed green in from behind me, and I thought there was somebody with a flashlight shining from behind me. And I stopped and I turned around, and I couldn't see anybody. I was wondering what was going on, so it took me a while to do that. But you've seen that various documentaries and everything else where they show when the waves are crashing on the bioluminescence from the various algae We've had some very, very unique characters over the years inside of our club, and and I'm very fortunate. I wasn't there at the beginning of the club when it formed, but I've got to know a lot of the members over the years that were right at the beginning, whether it would be like Elliot and Don Moore, Phil Kettle, and a number of others, Jack Sims, Jack Imhoff, and all of those guys that were really a strong part of developing a lot of different flies and techniques and stuff like that. Bill Christmas, him and Helen were, mentors to Anna and myself a number of years and everything else, and got us out fishing with them. And so I'm very thankful for the club, because it was always a place where you could go to learn. And I think that's part of our duty now as older members and everything else, is to pass some of that learning onto our club members and everything else, so that they can benefit. I mean, it's what it is a sharing and everything else. But like I said earlier on, one of my best fishing buddies, Ken Geddes, and everything else, it was like about 3 or 4 years before I found out that he was a butcher, because it didn't matter. We just talked fishing. We went fishing together, and then the other ones, oh, you're a lawyer? I didn't know that. It was like, where so many other conversations in public and everything else, and you meet people for the first time, it's always, oh, what do you do? Oh, what do you do? Well, it didn't matter. When you walked into the club at the Izaak Walton, it didn't matter. It was like, well, where have you been fishing? What have you caught? What are you using? So.
When did you first join the club?
I joined back at about 1980, 81.
Yeah.
I had moved here into the province in December of 79, and I think probably that year, 1980, I went off to the first forum, and from there, as soon as I went to the forum, after that, I joined the club.
Then you soon moved up the ranks and ended up
well, they saw this great big sucker sign on my head, and they assigned me a job right away. The next thing I know is there's another guy that was doing program chairman and everything else, had brought me in, and I was going to help him out with doing programs. And another guy was getting upset because he had me lined up for his job. So it was like a battle between the two of them as to who would actually get me to do the job. And then after a while, it became more of a social activity that these are your friends and people. It didn't matter. One of the things I found is that you never asked what somebody did for a job, because it didn't matter. You were all just interested in fly fishing, and it would go years before you found out, oh, you do that? Oh, really? And so it became a social activities that you didn't want to miss out on a meeting, because you like to sit there and go to the meeting and then go out for a beer afterwards. And so it became a very important part of one's socials activities, but we're sort of curtailed with what we can do with that today.
In that case, I think, Jim, I'd like to thank you very much for giving us a different slant and a different perspective. And I really cannot express how much we appreciate the founding members and the folks that came before, because you've really given us a lot in the past, and you're still giving us a lot now. And I really want to thank you very much.
It's much appreciated. It's my honor to sit there and to feel that, that I've got something worthwhile to pass along to you.
Yeah.